Great. Well, thank you all for coming, and thanks so much for the invitation. My name is Elijah Cole, and I'm a machine learning research scientist at a company called Altos Labs, where I work on things different from this now, working on machine learning for scientific discovery in the context of molecular biology. But today I'm going to talk about some of my previous work on machine learning for global scale species mapping. And so the reason for these topics sort of coming to importance in machine learning lately is that it's been increasingly recognized that biodiversity is a very important marker of ecosystem robustness. It's the kind of thing that will help natural systems weather climate change more effectively. But monitoring biodiversity is pretty challenging, and so there's been a lot of interest in using machine learning to help us monitor biodiversity over the last few years. And fortunately, there's been a huge growth in the amount of biodiversity data that's available out there. So what this plot is showing is the growth of species observation data in a resource called GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And this is a sort of a clearinghouse that collects species observations from lots of different platforms, including these community science efforts like iNaturalist, eBird, and PlantNet that allow regular people to collect species observations as they go about their daily lives, out on hikes or walking through their cities. And so one of these community science projects that we work closely with is called iNaturalist. And so this is a community science platform where you can download the app and you can take photos on your phone of any plant or animal species you come across. And you can upload these photos to the platform, and the community will help to identify the species that's present in those photos. And then what you have is, longitude and latitude where you took the photo, as well as an ID for that species. And this becomes a very large source of biodiversity data that scientists can use for ecological monitoring. So they're up to something like, I think this is fairly recent, 177 million observations from 3 million unique observers. So these are some images from iNaturalist, just to get a sense for the diversity and what they tend to look like. And so you can see it's a wide variety of plant and animal species, as well as different types of evidence for the animal's presence. Sometimes it's the animal directly, like the squirrel. Sometimes it's things like the shell or remains of an animal, footprints or dung or eggs or any of these things. So there's a lot of different forms this data can take, but all of it can be identified to the species level and then can help scientists monitor biodiversity. One thing that we've worked closely with the iNat folks to do is to turn iNaturalist data into challenging computer vision data sets. And so our most recent variant of this is called iNat 2021. And so this is a 10,000 way classification data set with 2.7 million training images, 50K val, and 500K test images that is meant to propose a challenge to recent work in computer vision. And so some of the challenges that are unique to this data are, for instance, very high intra-class variation. So these are 3 images from the same species. And the same species can look very different at different points in its life, right? Where you have the larva, or the maturing larva, or the adult. All of these look extremely different, but they're in fact the same species. We also have a very low interclass variation in many cases. So for instance, between these 2 moth species, it can be pretty hard for a layperson to tell them apart. But it turns out that the key is whether the bands on the wings touch or whether they're separate. So very difficult to tell the difference unless you know what you're looking for. This data also tends to be very imbalanced. So as you can imagine, with people collecting these observations as they walk around their cities or go on hikes, common species, naturally common species get photographed a lot more often than rare species. And there's also other biases in how this data is collected. But typically you have orders of magnitude of difference between the most common species in your data set and the rarest species in your data set. And so to look at an example, you have a photo like this and you want to know, is this a European toad or a spiny toad? The 2 species that look very similar. And so if you just train a standard image classifier on the iNat 21 data set, you can reach an accuracy of something like 65%. But there's more information we know than just the image. We also know where the image was taken. And so if we know something about the distribution of these two species, the European toad and the spiny toad, we can use that information to help disambiguate a difficult problem. If the image is ambiguous, it is very, very difficult to tell which species it is. Maybe you can tell which species it is based on the location where the photo was taken instead of just the image. And so this is the topic of one of our first works in this space, where we try to use machine learning to solve the problem of identifying species in images using not only the image, but also the location information. The way we do this is we factorize the problem into two parts, where we have an image classifier, as usual, takes in the image and produces a prediction for which species is present. We also have a model that we call a geoprior, which takes in a location and predicts the likelihood of different species being present at that location. And so the way the model works is you take in the image and you pass it through your image classifier, you take in your location, and pass it through your geoprior, and you combine the two predictions in a pointwise multiplication. So you just have a probability distribution over species for the image classifier, then you have a weight for each species from the geoprior, you multiply them together, and then you use this new distribution to decide which species is in the image. And so as before, we saw if you use the images alone, you can reach a species classification accuracy of something like 65%. Using the geoprior allows you to improve this performance pretty dramatically.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
What sort of features is the geo classifier used for that just plain lat long doesn't give you?
Sorry, would you say that one more time?
So you pass the lat long through a model, right, to get some sort of features out, presumably. So what sort of features are these that you don't get just from lat long?
Yeah, strictly speaking, lat long is the only input to the model, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. But the way the model is, the geoprior is trained, is using many, many observations of many species jointly. And so what the geoprior knows that lat long doesn't know is the joint co-occurrence likelihoods between different species.
Oh, so the geoprior actually outputs these likelihoods, basically.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
It gives you a likelihood for each species, but it's trained jointly across many species. And so that joint co-occurrence information winds up sort of distilled into the network. And we'll see this in a little more detail in a minute. And so, so what we show in this bin, that first work is that geoprior is useful for improving the performance of an image classifier, but a separate question is whether the geoprior actually encodes a species range. And so what we mean by the range is, intuitively, it's like a polygon that encapsulates the area over which you expect a species to roam during its lifespan. And so here's an example for the house wren from BirdLife International. So the species range is usually derived from, but distinct from the raw observations that you might have for the species. So ranges are often constructed using a combination of the raw data and ecological prior knowledge and other factors. The problem is that we have ranges for relatively few species. So these are all very much ballpark numbers, but there's something like 9 million species expected to be on Earth, of which we have names for about 1.7 million and maps for fewer than 100,000. And many of these maps are, even if they exist, they're often out of date by the time they're published. And having these maps is very important because knowing the ranges of different species informs our conservation priorities. Right? If you know that a species has is declining and only exists in a certain range, that tells you where you need to focus your conservation efforts. And so there's a lot of work on this problem going back many decades. It's a core problem in ecology. So some of the classic methods include maxent, where you're building the sort of maximum entropy probability distribution given a bunch of species observation data. There's other lines of work that look more like sort of hierarchical Bayesian models, like HMSC. And more recently, there's a lot of interest in this problem from a machine deep learning perspective, including TMSE from Carla Gomez's group at Cornell, where they were working on machine learning models that can explicitly factorize sort of correlations between species and relationships to the environment, as well as competition series like the GeoLifeplay competitions that are run every year to try to take things like satellite imagery and environmental covariates and predict species presence and absence. And there's many more works in this space. I heard a bloop, so is it a question?
There's nothing in the chat.
Okay, I'll assume not. And so for interested readers, there's a review paper that we worked on that focuses on reviewing species distribution modeling for machine learning practitioners in particular. So I encourage you to take a look at that if you're interested in getting a sense for the broader scope of this space. And so back to this question, does our geoprior, it's useful for image classification, but does it actually encode a species, range correctly? That was the focus in this work, which we did with collaborators at UMass, University of Edinburgh, and iNat, where the goal is to understand, actually in terms of the accuracy of these range maps, how good are they? How do they compare to sort of expert ecological knowledge? So the problem we're focused on here is something called presence-only range estimation. It's the idea is that you want to train a neural network that can estimate the probability that the species is present at a given location. So this is range estimation in general. However, the training data consists of sparse locations where the species is present. That is, you don't have any information about where the species has been confirmed to be absent. You only have these presence points. So that's why it's presence-only range estimation. And this is exactly the kind of data you get from something like iNaturalist, where people take photos of different species. That tells you where the species is present, but there's no indication of where different species are absent. And so for this paper, we took the data from iNaturalist. We took all of their observations before 2022, which is about 35 million different species observations covering 50,000 species. And so starting from this training data from iNaturalist, each color here represents a different species, and so you have these presence occurrences for different species. What we do is we've trained an implicit neural network that takes in longitude and latitude and predicts a latent representation for that location. And then we have a multi-label classifier on top of that that predicts the presence or absence for each individual species. There's 50,000 different classification heads. And at the end, by sweeping longitude and latitude over the Earth's surface, you can produce these sort of species range maps for each species that you've trained on. And so for one species, the way this works is just to get a sense for what's one thing that's commonly done in the ecology literature. You have X that's an input, some kind of location encoding. It's often environmental covariates like longitude, or not longitude and latitude, but like elevation and temperature and humidity and things like this. And then you have just a linear classifier that takes those location inputs, and passes it through a nonlinearity to map it to the 0-1 range. And this can give you a prediction for whether the species is present or absent. And so just a simple sort of linear transformation of the location encoding passed through nonlinearity to get some value between 0 and 1. In these deep learning models, we're doing something very similar, except that the location encoding is produced by a deep neural network instead of being a set of sort of manually curated environmental features. And then when we move from one species to multiple species, we just have separate classification heads for each species. So we use the same base encoder that takes in longitude and latitude and produces a representation of the environment. And then we decode that through separate classification heads for each species to actual species occurrence probability predictions. So presence absence data is the kind of sort of the gold standard in ecology. So it looks like this, where you have locations where the species is known to be absent and locations where the species is known to be present. Whereas presence only data, you have no confirmed absences and you just have these presence locations. And so in the presence absence case, this is all relatively easy because it fits perfectly into the general supervised learning framework, but presence only is a little trickier. And so this is related to another problem we worked on in the context of multi-label image classification, where you want to predict every relevant label for the image. So for instance, here you have this photo, and so you want to predict there's a truck, there's a tree, there's a fence. There's multiple classes in this image. Just like at one location, you have multiple species there that you want to predict all of them. And so for an image like this, you'd have many categories, some of which are present, some which are absent. But annotating all of these categories exhaustively is very expensive, so you have to review every single one. but you only observe, in this case, a single positive label for each image. And so this is a sort of a general version of this machine learning problem where you have a single positive label and you want to learn to train effective multi-label classifiers. And this is sort of exactly the same question we're interested in the species distribution modeling case, where we, at every location, someone takes a photo, that gives you a single positive species label for that location. What we want to have eventually is a multi-label classifier that can take a location and predict all the species that are present there. So it's just an aside, but there's a very similar problem that we worked on in computer vision for another perspective on the same challenge. In the context of the spatial data, the way we train with presence-only data is that initially we have this. This is a cartoon of the unobserved ground truth. So the red boxes are species that are absent. The green boxes are species that are present. And so we don't get to see this, but this is what's truly the case about a given location on the Earth. And all we observe is a single positive label at the location where someone took a photo or sampled assessed whether a species was present at that location. And so one way we can train these models is by sampling a random other location on the Earth's surface and saying that that species is absent there. Right. So this allows you to have some positive data and some negative data, and so you can avoid the model collapsing to always predicting the positive label when you train. And the rationale behind this is that most species don't span the whole Earth, and so if you are, for a particular species, if you pick a negative location at random, most of the time you're going to be right that that species does not occur there. And so we use this idea, and we also try a few other ideas, different ways of sampling these sort of pseudo-negatives to train the classifier, and we compare these different loss functions in the paper. And so we're going to go through a couple results, but more detailed results can be found in the paper itself. One of the key contributions here is a set of evaluation tasks. So one of the biggest challenges in working in species distribution modeling is that there's really a lack of ground truth presence-absence data. There's not a ton of this, and what you have is usually only for a few species. So we had to sort of think hard about how we should evaluate these large-scale, global-scale distribution models when you don't really have global-scale evaluation data. And so we proposed 4 different benchmark tasks, each of which evaluates a slightly different aspect of the model. So the first 2 of them are make use of what we know about presence-absence distributions from ecology. So there's a project at Cornell called the eBird Status and Trends Project, where they have extremely high-quality range maps for 500 bird species in North America. And so that's, those are as close to ground truth as you tend to get in this area. And so we use all of those maps as a presence-absence evaluation task. We also pulled in maps from the IUCN, who manage the Red List of Endangered Species. So they have range maps for 2,500 species worldwide. And so together we have 3,000 species here, which is just a tiny fraction of all the species that are out there, but it's sort of the best you can do at any kind of a large scale. Then we also evaluate these models on the geo-prior task, which we talked about earlier, whether the maps that the models are producing improve the performance of an image classifier that's trained on 40,000 different species. And we also evaluate the quality of the latent representations themselves. So the idea is if you train these geo models, they get a latent embedding of location as well as the species maps. And so for this geo feature task, we don't use the species maps, we just use the latent embedding. And what we do is try to do a transfer learning task to predict 9 densely available geographical features in the United States. So things like elevation or temperature, things like this. So it's basically assessing the extent to which the geo model is capturing sort of latent environmental features based on the species occurrences alone. And so here's a couple examples of maps produced by this model. So this is a species of flower that you can see in Western Europe. Here's the observations for iNaturalist, and here's the predictions for our model. Go through a couple of these. There's another one here in Ecuador and Peru. You can see it's insect species, and the model captures that range well. This is a plant species that seems to be only in New Zealand, and the model is able to lock onto that. Another one in the eastern US. And so you can see these ranges have, odd shapes, and these are consequences of the exact, like the nonlinearities you use in the network. This is an area, we haven't explored very much yet. As how does the design of the network affect the qualitative properties of the ranges? But it's an interesting area that we're hoping to move into. And so quantitatively, what we're looking at here is the performance on 3 different tasks. The blue and the red bar are for these mapping tasks where you're predicting the presence and absence of known species. And the yellow bar is for the geographical prior task, where you're improving the performance of an image classifier. And so as a baseline, simple logistic regression is a sort of a commonly used model in ecology, and so that's what we use as a baseline here. So compared to the simple logistic regression, our method, which is called Signer, performs much better quantitatively on all of these tasks. One other aspect we study is the impact of different input features. And so as the question earlier asked about, these geospatial models, they're only taking in longitude and latitude, so what do they get you that you don't get from, what's the point of decoding them like that? Well, one way to assess that is to look at what happens when you use different input features for these models. So we're comparing logistic regression to our model Signer. And so these bars are only using latitude and longitude as input to the model. And so we have our 2 bars for the 2 different mapping tasks. Then we also consider using environmental variables. So instead of just longitude and latitude as input, you can use a suite of 20 commonly used environmental variables capturing things like altitude and temperature. And we can see that improves both models. The logistic regression and the Signer models both improve a little bit from having environmental variables. But importantly, the Signer doesn't improve very much. And so this tells us that the model is actually doing a pretty good job of learning the latent features of environments based on only the species occurrence data. And we can also use them jointly, and there's not a lot of benefits either to combining them for the Signer model. The logistic regression sort of consistently ticks up for these as you add these kind of more complex features. And the nice thing, by the way, about if you can get away from using environmental features, that's very nice, because they're typically not available everywhere on Earth, or if they are, they're very coarse. And so if you require environmental features, it tends to limit the places that you can actually use your model and the resolution at which you can make predictions. These models also tend to scale pretty well as you increase the amount of data that's available. So each dot here is a different model trained on different amounts of data. And so this is one of the mapping tasks. And so as you either have 10 observations per species, 100 observations per species, or 1,000 observations per species. And so increasing the amount of data per species tends to increase the performance quite a lot with these models. In addition, as you train on more species, even ones that are these are unrelated species to the ones that you're evaluating on, or different ones anyway, you also get a performance improvement as you go left to right. And so these are, what we're evaluating on here is always the same set of 500 birds, but then we're adding in 4,000, 8,000 or more different species just from, randomly selected from the broader data set. So these models improve both as you increase the amount of data for each species and as you increase the number of species that are being trained on. And we interpret this to be due to the fact that the Signer models are jointly predicting all of the species together. And so as you train on more species in parallel, you seem to be learning a better representation of the environment. And that's useful for predicting even other species. So some qualitative examples here. This is for wood thrush, which is a species of bird often found in North America. And so the green and the light gray are correct locations, so either the true positives or the true negatives, and the red and the dark gray are incorrect locations. And so with 10 examples per class, you can see that the model makes plenty of mistakes, especially around sort of the boundaries. As you increase the amount of data to 100 examples per class or 1,000 examples per class, the model cleans up the range and tends to perform better and make fewer mistakes. There are still, of course, residual mistakes, which tend to be concentrated along the boundaries of the range, which makes sense. We can also take a look at the location embedding that these models learn. And so this is what we're doing here is we're sweeping longitude and latitude over the entire globe and taking an embedding for each location. And then we're doing ICA to project that down to 3 dimensions and visualizing that as RGB. And so this is one way of visualizing sort of what the features look like spatially. And so when we train only on 10 examples per species, this is what the map looks like. If we increase it to 1,000 examples per species, we see that the map gets a lot more detail in it. There's many more sort of precise boundaries you can see observed, especially like, West Coast, you can see maybe mountain ranges popping out. So this tells us that as you increase the number of species observations you're training on, the latent representation gets more spatially detailed, and that may be what helps improve model performance. Finally, we can take a look at the actual species embeddings that are also learned. So in the Signer model, longitude and latitude are decoded to this latent representation of the environment. And then there's this, you have a learned vector for each species that is combined with the environmental embedding to produce the presence probability for that species. So we can also look at these learned species embeddings as well. This is a Teasney UMAP of the species embeddings over all of the categories. And so if you look at, you can pick different points in the species embedding cloud and look at the corresponding map. And so as you move around, you can see that species that are embedded close together by learned species embeddings tend to have similar maps. So here we're moving around, we're sort of taking a walk through this set of species embeddings. And you can see that, as we don't move very far in the species embedding, we tend to see similar maps pop out as well. And so this work led to an actual deployment on iNaturalist. This was deployed as the geo model in September 2023. And so iNaturalist is actually using this on their platform to assist their computer vision models in making predictions for which species is present in images that are uploaded to the platform. Previously, they used sort of just a discretized version of their observed data on a 1-degree grid. But the geomodel maps tend to be a lot more spatially detailed and sort of fill in a lot of these gaps where people maybe haven't gone here, but there could still be the species present in between. So to summarize this branch of work, you can train these implicit neural networks on tens of thousands of species jointly, tens of billions of observations, and you wind up with a model that can produce pretty good range maps for all of these species. And it's a pretty small model. Training the model for 50,000 species is a 50 megabyte model, small enough to run on a phone. Has nice scaling properties. More data improves the performance in a reliable way. And we put out a suite of benchmark tasks to evaluate this sort of environmental representation learning approach so that people can build on this and improve it. But there's plenty more to be done. We'll talk about some limitations at the end of this. I want to stop briefly if there are any questions.
I think so far all clear. Thank you.
Cool. I'm going to talk about a couple extensions of this line of work that we're very excited about. The first one is an active learning-based approach to species range estimation. This is led by Chris Lang, who's one of Oisin McKay's PhD students at the University of Edinburgh. So the idea is, we take a species, we can look at what we think we know about its range, and then look at the data that underlies that range. And what we see is that there are regions where we have a lot of data, where maybe we should be confident about the range, and other regions where the data is pretty limited. And so the data acquisition process is responsible for this. So in these community science projects that generate all of these large collections of data, the data is acquired passively. So the maps tend to look like maps of population, right? It's wherever people are and where they're taking photos, that's where you're going to wind up collecting data. And the reason they do this is, it simplifies the task of new users. It really lowers the bar to taking a photo or collecting the data, instead of forcing people to go to certain places to collect balanced data. Right? This is not fun for new users. But if we could direct individuals to specific locations, we could sort of correct for biases that are present in the original data and resolve uncertainties about where a species is present and absent. So in the sort of active data acquisition paradigm, what we do is we ask a user to go to a certain location to check if a certain species is present. And so if we know, for instance, that we have this one species present here, we could query a certain location and say, okay, we need someone to go here and check whether the species is present or absent. And maybe here, we find out that the species was present, then we can update our maps and say, okay, now this is what we think about the species range. We can query again, someone checks out whether the species is present here, and we say, no, okay, the species isn't there, and we can, again, update what we think we know about the species range. And so our approach is to estimate new species ranges as a weighted combination of existing models. And so what we mean by this is that you sample a few locations for the species, and as you're sampling, you're representing the range for the new species as a combination of ranges for other species that you've already learned that you have enough data for. So the idea here is like species ranges are not totally independent. They have species co-occur with their predators and with their prey and with certain kinds of environments. And so most species ranges should be similar to some other species ranges. And so it makes sense to treat these as sort of an overcomplete basis for representing the range of a new species. And so this is an expert range map for this yellow-footed green pigeon. And this is the results of our approach after 2 samples, one positive and one negative example. And you can keep going, 3 samples, 4 samples, gradually refining the range. Then you can compare. In the end, the model is able to get a pretty good estimate of this range from only 10 examples. Quantitatively, what we want to measure is, how good are these range estimates as a function of the number of examples we have to query. And so here we're looking at, how good these maps are as a function of the number of queries we issue, and higher is better. And so if you select your training points at random, performance improves slowly. You can use sort of classic active learning methods like uncertainty sampling. So this is where you pick the location that the model is most uncertain about, and you sample there. You get a much better performance as a function, much better sample efficiency here. Performance rises much faster as a function of the amount of training data. Our POSE method, particularly in the low sample regime, performs much better. And so you're able to get rapidly high performance and rapidly increasing performance with as few as 10 different training examples, which is very, very little in terms of sort of biodiversity data. So there's a lot more to this in the paper, and we won't go into the details here. But the upshot is that we can estimate these ranges with far fewer samples than passive random sampling, and there's a lot of application areas we could think of for these active learning methods. However, there's a few sort of idealized assumptions baked in right now. One is that users can go to any physical location, right? The model can say, okay, yeah, go to the peak of Mount Everest and check if the species is present. Obviously, that's not very practical. And we're also assuming that users are capable of confirming whether something is present or not. And so this is often a difficult task. Even if you see something that looks like that species, you still have to be pretty sure that you're right about that. And if you don't see it, you have to be convinced that you searched the area well enough that it's actually absent instead of you just missing it. So it's a difficult assumption as well. And the downside is that this makes the data collection process more complex. So this probably isn't something you'd want to use for beginners, but for enthusiasts who are really excited about hiking somewhere to go check for a certain kind of flower, this could be a really good way to collect better data in an active way. And there's one last project I want to talk about along these lines. This is just a quick highlight because this paper was just submitted on using large language models to improve species distribution modeling. This work was led by Max, who's a PhD student of Grant Van Horn's at UMass Amherst. Basic idea is to combine our signer models that we talked about before for range mapping with LLMs to enable zero-shot range estimation. And so I won't go into the architectural details, but essentially what we can do now is we can provide a description of a species habitat and say, okay, there's some species that is diurnal terrestrial, lives in a complex mixed gender social group. You get this set of text that describes the species habitat. You pass it through an LLM to produce an embedding, and we can use that to generate a range with the signer models. And the great thing about this is not, when you're training, you don't need to specify which species you're talking about. And so at test time, you can use a new text description of a species the model has never encountered before and get a range map for that as well. And so as far as I'm aware, this is the first demonstration of sort of zero-shot range estimation for species. And quantitatively, you can also use these text embeddings to guide sort of transfer learning models for few-shot learning. And so here, this dashed line is the performance of our signer model that's just trained on all of the species observation data. And these curves are showing sort of different approaches to, the green and the blue lines are showing performance if you augment the signer models with these language models. And you can see that with, as few as 5 or 10 observations, you can get very close to the performance of the fully trained joint signer model. And so this is a huge improvement in sample efficiency, as well as sort of a new capability to be able to do zero-shot estimation of species ranges. So I want to wrap up by talking about a few sort of open questions and challenges in this space. First is that this community science data is extremely, there's a lot of it, and it's very useful, but it's very biased as well. Some regions are very undersampled, some are very oversampled. There's certainly biases in time. Sometimes of the day, sometimes of the year, get more sampling. And there's also a lot of imbalance. Different species get reported with different frequencies. And these are all questions that people have considered in a more principled way from the statistics and ecology literature of decades past. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done thinking about those ideas and how we can build them into these new large-scale models. We also worry a lot about whether these models will propagate errors. And so, for instance, if you see, you take a photo of a panda in a zoo, then our geoprior models will give you a bad suggestion, right? They'll tell you that that animal is not in that zoo, and they can mislead your classifier. And so, figuring out how to make sure that that we're not doing too much, we're not biasing the data too much by using these models is another key problem. Figuring out how to best use environmental data is another very interesting question. So our models that are trained using only longitude and latitude are very compact, and they're very fast to train. They can run on a phone. But these richer environmental covariates could be more useful, more informative. And so there's climate variables, land cover, satellite imaging. There's a lot of work on remote sensing foundation models that could play into this. And so figuring out how to figure out how to make the models that use rich environmental covariates more compact and efficient, I think is an interesting future direction. Building in temporal information is also kind of an open question. We've done this in rudimentary ways in some of our previous work, but I think it's something that's we haven't explored to its full potential. Also, we want these ranges eventually, as you saw in the maps, they're mostly pretty blobby, right? They don't have a lot of super fine-grained detail, but the best maps we have from ecologists are much more fine-grained and informative. They tell you things about ranges at different times of year, lots of interleaving between populations in different locations. And so getting to a point where we can produce finer-grained range maps like this would be very useful. In addition, we're just thinking about distribution, or thinking about presence and absence mostly. But you could imagine also looking into things like abundance, trying to say how many individuals in this population do you have, which is a much harder question than just the presence and absence. There's also a lot of opportunity for using these models to have some kind of actual conservation impact. So in simplified terms, species with smaller ranges tend to have greater extinction likelihoods, and so there may be ways to use these models to rank and prioritize locations and species that are of concern going forward. So I want to thank many funders and collaborators, and particularly Oshin and Chris, who made many of these slides. Provide a list of the references for the papers we talked about. Just flash that real quick. The other thing, so all of the benchmarks and models and data for all of these papers are publicly available. So in particular, for the signer model, code and data is available for the models and the benchmarks. And we also have a demo running on Hugging Face that you can play around with as well if you like. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Great. There's some questions on the chat, so I'll read it out. There's two from Ankit. Question one, through geo-embeddings, can we observe the migratory pattern for a specific species?
Could I get that one more time?
So these like geo-embeddings, can we actually see the migratory patterns of, for instance, birds?
Migratory patterns. Yeah, so in the models that we used, the temporal models that we trained a while back, for instance, for this wood thrush, you actually can see here, fortunately chosen example, you can see migratory patterns from South America, or from Central America up into Eastern North America and back. So yes, you can pick this up with these kinds of models.
And then the second question, also from Ankit, is: are we able to distinguish granular classes of species, for example, specific breeds of dogs or cats, but wildlife species as well?
In general, yes. So with these iNaturalist data sets, scrolling, many of these species are quite similar. So we generally call this sort of fine-grained recognition is the umbrella term we use for this, when you have two different species that look very similar like this. And yes, typically you can solve this problem. So on the iNaturalist data sets, most of them are also competitions. And so we have sort of Kaggle pages running for them. And people are able to reach, I think on the latest one, iNat21, like 80, 90% accuracy over these 10,000 species. And so many of the pairs are easy to distinguish, but many of them are also very difficult to distinguish.
And then I have a couple of questions also just for myself, if I may.
Yeah.
So what happens if a species actually cannot be determined by humans? For instance, like these two moths can be kind of distinguished, but what about their eggs, for instance, or their pupae?
Yeah, so if species are not visually distinct at all, then obviously a computer vision model is toast, right? There's no hope for solving that problem. I think these are called cryptic species that are, you have to basically like sequence their DNA or dissect them to understand if they're different species. But you could actually solve this problem with the geo model. So you can imagine a case where you observe two photos of species that are visually indistinguishable, but one of them, if their ranges don't overlap, then the geo model can actually help you break that tie.
But are these still included in the iNaturalist data set, or are they kind of?
I think there are. We didn't, we don't have the expertise to know all of which species are cryptic, and so I think there are some species in that iNaturalist data set that are actually visually indistinguishable. It's not very many though.
Okay. There's a question from Ryan who's raised his hand. Ryan, do you want to just ask your question?
Yes. Hi, my name's Ryan, and first of all, a great presentation. I really enjoyed how you especially kind of navigated how to use like the iNaturalist data set and everything. So just a bit of introduction about myself. My name is Ryan Janejo. I'm a current student at the University of Toronto, and we're actually working on a very, very similar kind of project to this. So right now, my team and I'm working with a professor, and what right now our research is kind of how to make like a species classification system using RAG. So what we've done is that we've created like a sort of pipeline where first we have an image captioner to kind of like we have an input to be an image. We kind of use an LLM to kind of generate like a caption on that, and then we use a RAG pipeline which has vector stores based off of like Wikipedia and iNaturalist and other sort of databases, and we kind of use that to match the caption towards that database, and that will end up giving us like a few guesses or best estimates onto what like the species is. So I found like the entire presentation very, very interesting, especially because one of the things that we've kind of been considering is how can we incorporate multimodality into this, not only putting the image into it, but also putting like stuff like the geo classifications and geoscales as well. So I found like the entire presentation like super, super interesting and appealing. And I'd also love to connect further and talk to you more about like the research we're doing and how it kind of connects and overlaps with yours as well.
I think it sounds like very interesting work. Yeah, but it's useful. There's like trained geo models that are up and available, so you're certainly welcome to use them for anything you like.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you so much.
Maybe I'll ask one more question. If anybody has more, please chime in. So as an open source community, I have to ask, so what are opportunities for people, besides taking out their phones, downloading the app and snapping photos of animals or other wildlife? What else can people do, especially people with an ML background, to sort of get involved in this if they're interested?
Yes, there's a few things. So one is, yeah, we do run these competitions from time to time, the like iNat competitions. And so those are opportunities to try to make progress on the fundamental computer vision questions around fine-grained species classification. And then the advances there, can be useful to the iNaturalist folks as they think about how to train their vision models that they use on the back end. And so I think you can get involved through that. A lot of this work is centered at the FGVC, Fine-Grained Visual Categorization workshops, which happen at CUPR every year. So if you're going to be at CUPR, feel free to stop by, and I'll be there, as well as most of the people involved in this work. We do have all the code and data is available, so you're welcome to sort of hack on that and improve it, and use the benchmarks to see if you build something better. I think actually getting the apps is one thing that I think is it's pretty fun if you get into it. So like I use iNaturalist all the time. It's very fun to take photos of plants, animals, in new places. So I think that's a good maybe set of things to start. But there's a ton of open problems in this space, and the nice thing is like the data is very freely available. So unlike a lot of spaces like medical imaging where the data is harder to come by and there's a lot of red tape, there's a kind of a growing amount of freely available data and resources. So if you're a machine learning person, you can get up and running, training models that like enable new kinds of, ecological science, much easier than you could in the medical field, say.
Great, thanks a lot. I think this is it for the questions. So thank you so much for speaking to us. Thank you to everybody for attending, and we'll post this talk on YouTube in a few days.
Thank you all.
All right, thanks a lot.